living beings on the face of the earth, there have been biologists. And what I mean by that is people have always wondered about other living things. Back even when we were cavemen, they probably wondered how plants grow and how other animals live and things like that. But before the invention of the microscope, the only living things people knew about was what they can see with the naked eye. And you can't see cells with your naked eye. And so people had no idea that life existed at the cellular level. They thought, well, you know, what we can see are the only life forms on Earth. But about 400 years ago, right at the beginning of the 1600s, the microscope was invented, and it was a breakthrough in the field of biology. Now biologists could look at living things and see them at their cellular level and see new organisms, new species that they didn't know existed because these were unicellular organisms and they just couldn't see them before. One of the first scientists to construct a microscope and observe things with it was a fellow named Robert Hooke. He was an Englishman, and for some reason, I'm not sure why, he looked at a cork. Maybe he liked drinking wine, I don't know, but he built himself a microscope and looked at the cork microscopically. And this is something like what he saw. He saw little chambers there. And these are not actually living cells. These are part of the walls of cells that have died off. But it reminded him of little rooms, maybe little prison cells. And so Robert Hooke coined the term cells for these little microscopic compartments. And he really didn't do too much more to advance the cellular theory of biology, but he at least put it on the map and coined this term. The major scientist who really put cellular biology on the map was this fellow right here. He was a Dutch fellow, and I'm probably butchering his name a little bit, but it's Anthony van Leeuwenhoek. And he was actually a businessman. He would buy various types of textiles, cloth, and make drapes out of them. But he became interested in microscopes as a way to look at the threads of the cloth closely. And when he built these microscopes for himself, he decided to start looking at living things. And he became so fascinated by this that he eventually started publishing papers on his microscopic discoveries. He looked at all sorts of things. He looked at plants and animal tissues and bodily fluids under the microscope, water from swamps and sewage and things like that. And everywhere he looked, he saw these little tiny cells, these little ball-shaped bits of living things. And people were astounded when he began publishing papers with the drawings of things like this, because as I said, they just had no idea that life existed at that level. So he's the one who first said that started this thing that's now called the cellular theory of life. And these are the major parts of what's called the cellular theory of biology. And in a nutshell, the cellular theory is cells are the smallest units of life. Now, what the heck does that mean? Well, it means two things. One thing it means is nothing smaller or simpler than a cell is considered to be alive. Here we go. I think I showed you a slide kind of like this on actually the first day of this class that shows the hierarchy of biological complexity. Atoms, remember the building blocks of molecules, like this DNA molecule is made out of carbons and nitrogens and hydrogens and oxygen atoms. And then these biological macromolecules are the building blocks of things called organelles, like the nucleus of the cell and the membrane of the cell. And organelles are the building blocks of cells, and cells are the building blocks of tissues, and tissues are the building blocks of organs, and organs are the building blocks of organ systems, and organ systems are what entire organisms are made out of. And what I'm saying is, on this hierarchy of biological complexity, cells are the smallest part that are considered alive. The molecules that make up the cell, like the DNA and the proteins and the lipids and the carbohydrates, sometimes they seem kind of alive because at least proteins actually can grab other molecules and manipulate them. But nevertheless, they are not considered to be alive. Only cells and things higher than cells on this hierarchy, like tissues and organ systems and organisms, only those things are considered to actually be alive. Only those things meet all of those traits of living things that we talked about on the first day of class. So that's one thing that the cellular theory says. Nothing smaller than a cell is considered alive. And the other thing that the cellular theory says is that all living things are made of one or more cells. If you remember this slide of the three domains of life, eukarya, bacteria, and archaea, there are millions of species within these three domains, but all of them are made out of one or more cells. Does anybody remember the name for organisms like bacteria whose entire body is one cell? Unicellular, right. Whereas ones like ourselves, whose bodies are made of many cells, are multicellular, right. So it doesn't matter if you're multicellular or unicellular, everybody's made out of at least one cell. And for multicellular things like ourselves, we're made out of trillions of cells. All right, now, I think when I first showed you this slide, I showed you this little division line here, and I said that there's actually two major varieties of cells on Earth. There's a larger, more complex kind called eukaryotic cells, and all of the species that are in the eukarya domain have that type of cell. That's why they call it the eukarya domain. Whereas the species in the bacteria domain and the archaea domain are made out of a smaller, more primitive cell type called a prokaryotic cell. And so you've got these two different cell types. But for a minute, let's just ignore the distinction between those two cell types and focus in on what all cells contain, whether they are eukaryotic cells or prokaryotic cells. And here's the big four. These are the four things that all cells are going to have, no matter what type they are. And to begin with, all cells are going to have a cell membrane. Remember, if you think of the cell as like a tiny water balloon, this is like the rubber skin of the water balloon, the outer boundary of the cell. All cells have a watery part inside that's called the cytoplasm. Again, just like a water balloon. All cells will have at least one chromosome inside. Remember, the chromosomes are the DNA where they have their genetic material. Some cells have only one chromosome, some have more. We have 46 chromosomes inside our cells. And lastly, all cells have little structures called ribosomes inside. Ribosomes are pretty small, and so you can't really see them on this photograph. But if you could, there'd be little tiny organelles that are floating around inside the cytoplasm, and those are the ribosomes. All right, so all cells have those four things. Let's now get back to the eukaryotic-prokaryotic distinction and see what's different about eukaryotic cells and prokaryotic cells. Well, here is the defining difference between eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells. A eukaryotic cell has what's called a nucleus, which means a membrane, a phospholipid bilayer that surrounds and protects its DNA, whereas prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus. Their DNA, their chromosomes, just float around inside the cytoplasm. Here's a cartoon of a eukaryotic cell, and these are supposed to be the chromosomes right here, and this purpley looking thing around them is the nucleus. And so don't get confused. The nucleus is different from the cell membrane up here. The cell membrane surrounds the entire cell. The nucleus is a membrane that surrounds just the DNA, like you see there. So it's sort of like an extra added layer of protection to especially protect the chromosomes. It's still a phospholipid bilayer, just like the cell membrane is, but it's an extra phospholipid bilayer inside the cell. And whereas prokaryotic cells do not have that. Here's a prokaryotic cell. Here's its chromosome right here. But notice there's no extra membrane around it. The prokaryotic cells just do not have a nucleus. And so that is the defining difference. If I ask you on a quiz or an exam, what is the difference between prokaryotic cell and eukaryotic cell? You must say, Mr. Edens, eukaryotic cells have a nucleus, prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus. That is the definition, the distinction, the official distinction between the two. Now, there are some other differences between eukaryotic cells and prokaryotic cells, but these are not considered the defining difference. The defining difference is the nucleus. But what is this? What are these other distinctions? Well, for one thing, eukaryotic cells have membranous organelles, whereas prokaryotic cells do not have any membranous organelles. What are those things? Well, going on here for a minute, organelles are structures inside the cell that help the cell carry out functions that keep it alive and operating. And this word sounds a lot like organ, our body parts, and it deliberately does. Just like you have organs like your stomach and your heart and your lungs that keep you alive and functioning, cells have organelles inside them, these little structures that keep them alive and functioning. And these organelles can be membranous, meaning that they're made out of a membrane, phospholipid bilayer. But other organelles are non-membranous, meaning they're made out of other molecules like proteins and in some cases nucleic acids. So just looking at this eukaryotic cell right here, we'll talk about some of these organelles on Wednesday, but this one's called a Golgi apparatus. It's a membranous organelle. Its walls are made out of phospholipid bilayer. This one's called a mitochondria. It's also a membranous organelle. This one's called the endoplasmic reticulum. It's a membranous organelle. These are, I think, vacuoles or vesicles. They're also membranous organelles. So eukaryotic cells have membranous organelles. Prokaryotic cells do not. You don't see any membranous organelles floating around the cytoplasm. So what are these things? Well, those are supposed to be the ribosomes, which are non-membranous organelles. Ribosomes are made out of protein and RNA, but not made out of membrane. All right, so one distinction is whether the cell has membranous organelles or not. Another distinction between prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells is the size of the cells. Prokaryotic cells are much smaller than eukaryotic cells. This is a pretty realistic size comparison between the two types of cells. There's a little prokaryotic cell and the giant eukaryotic cell. The exact size difference really depends on what type of eukaryotic cell you're comparing the prokaryotic cell to, but generally 10 times to 100 times larger